The alarm for Gate 4 started screaming at 2:11 a.m. sharp. Not the normal pressure warning either. This was the old emergency flood siren buried deep inside the water treatment plant, a sound so loud and mechanical it vibrated through the concrete walls beneath my feet while every light inside the control room flickered red. I remember staring at the security monitors, trying to understand why the gate had opened by itself. The flood channel beyond Reservoir 4 stretched black and endless beneath the rainstorm outside while thousands of gallons of dark water rushed violently through the spillway. Then the emergency radio crackled beside the control panel. "Daniel," a man whispered through heavy static. "Do not look into the water." My stomach tightened instantly because I recognized the voice immediately. Frank Delaney, the night supervisor who drowned near Gate 4 8 years earlier. Before I could answer, one of the perimeter cameras shifted slowly downward toward the flood channel beneath the gate. At first, the rushing water looked completely normal under the floodlights. Then shapes began surfacing inside it. Pale human figures drifted silently beneath the current while dozens of faces stared upward through the black water directly toward the camera. The sirens continued screaming through the station while pressure valves slammed open throughout the underground tunnels beneath the plant. Then something climbed slowly onto the spillway railing outside Gate 4, wearing Frank Delaney's raincoat. 3 nights earlier. I started working nights at Blackwater Treatment Facility because I needed a job where nobody asked personal questions anymore. After my divorce was finalized, I spent nearly a year drifting between temporary maintenance contracts and utility work across western Pennsylvania without staying anywhere long enough to feel stable. My name is Daniel Mercer, 34 years old. Former municipal systems technician with enough certifications to repair industrial filtration equipment, but not enough motivation left to care where I ended up using them. Blackwater hired me in late November after their overnight supervisor retired unexpectedly. The pay was decent. Housing came included through an old maintenance apartment above the administration wing. Most importantly, the position required almost no direct interaction with people, aside from occasional county inspections and morning shift handoffs. At the time, the idea of spending nights alone monitoring pumps and filtration systems beside a reservoir sounded almost peaceful. Blackwater sat nearly 20 miles outside the nearest town, surrounded by dense pine forest and abandoned quarry roads winding through the hills. The facility itself looked older than I expected. Massive concrete filtration basins connected by underground service tunnels beneath rusted catwalks, with sodium floodlights reflecting off endless dark water. Rain fell constantly during my first week there. Not storms exactly. Just steady cold rainfall turning the entire property slick and reflective after sunset. The reservoir stretched beyond the western flood channels like a black inland sea disappearing into fog after dark. During daylight, the plant looked purely industrial. Pipes, drainage gates, maintenance sheds. At night, especially during heavy rain, the place felt isolated in a way difficult to explain properly. The floodlights never illuminated enough of the surrounding property at once. Beyond the treatment pools and perimeter fencing, the darkness around Blackwater always seemed deeper than it should have been. The outgoing supervisor trained me during my first 2 shifts. Walter Griggs. Mid-60s maybe. Thick gray beard, nicotine-stained fingers, and the exhausted posture of someone who'd spent too many years listening to industrial machinery in empty buildings after midnight. He walked me through the routine maintenance procedures first. Pump pressure checks. Filtration cycles. Reservoir valve monitoring. Most of the overnight work involved watching the floodgate systems during storms when water levels rose too high near the spillways. Simple enough. Then, around 2 in the morning during my second shift, Walter took me down into the lower control room beneath the western reservoir channels. The underground section smelled like chlorine, wet concrete, and rusted metal soaked by decades of moisture leaking through the walls. Old flood maps covered the control panels beside handwritten maintenance notes pinned across the pipes overhead. And directly above the largest pressure console, someone had bolted a metal sign into the concrete wall. Gate 4 remains closed after midnight. I asked Walter what the sign meant, expecting some story about damaged flood controls or outdated safety regulations. Instead, he stared toward the reservoir monitors for several seconds before answering quietly. "You never open that gate at night," he said. "Not for maintenance. Not for inspections. Not for anything." Then he handed me a separate binder labeled Night Reservoir Procedures. The instructions inside looked less like official utility documentation and more like survival rules typed by someone increasingly paranoid over time. Never inspect Gate 4 after 12 a.m. If movement appears inside the spillway cameras, shut the monitors off immediately. Do not answer voices coming from the drainage tunnels beneath the reservoir. If the emergency siren activates without pressure failure, remain inside the control room until sunrise. And the final rule, printed larger than the others: if someone is standing near Gate 4 during rainstorms, verify their reflection in the water before speaking to them. Before leaving after my final training shift, Walter stopped near the maintenance stairs leading back upstairs and glanced once toward the underground floodgate monitors. "Frank Delaney opened Gate 4 during a storm back in 2017, he said quietly. "County records say he slipped into the spillway and drowned during a pressure release. But nobody ever recovered a body." He paused there long enough for the sound of rushing water beneath the plant to fill the silence around us. Then he added one final sentence before climbing the stairs toward the surface. "After enough rain, the reservoir starts remembering people." I watched him disappear into the dim maintenance hallway above while the underground control room hummed softly beneath flickering fluorescent lights. And somewhere far below the spillway tunnels behind the concrete walls, I thought I heard something moving slowly through the drainage channels underneath Gate 4. The first few nights alone at Blackwater almost convinced me Walter's rules were nothing more than habits built from too many years working isolated overnight shifts beside old industrial equipment. Water treatment plants produce strange sounds naturally. Pipes expand under pressure. Reservoir gates vibrate during storm runoff. Echoes travel unpredictably through underground concrete tunnels filled with moving water. I understood all of that rationally because I'd worked enough municipal maintenance jobs to know how quickly lonely night crews turn ordinary mechanical problems into superstitions. My routine settled in quickly after Walter retired. Around sundown, I inspected the upper filtration basins, checked chemical balances, and monitored reservoir levels through the storm control systems downstairs. By midnight, most of the work slowed into observation more than maintenance. Just me alone in the underground control room listening to pumps hum behind the walls while rain hammered softly against the spillway channels outside. The isolation at Blackwater felt heavier after midnight. The lower control room sat directly beneath the western reservoir channel, where thousands of gallons of runoff water moved constantly through reinforced flood tunnels under the plant. Even when every system functioned perfectly, the underground level never became completely quiet. Water echoed through the concrete walls at all hours, producing low hollow sounds beneath the pressure valves and filtration pumps surrounding the control stations. Some nights, the drainage tunnels almost sounded conversational if you listened too long. I understood why Frank Delaney's drowning story lingered among the remaining day crews. Places like Blackwater absorb tragedy into routine over time. Workers disappear. Accidents happen during storms. Then, eventually, you people build rituals around avoiding whatever part of the facility became associated with death. Gate 4 probably represented nothing more than that. An old floodgate was tied psychologically to a bad accident that everyone preferred not discussing directly anymore. The first strange incident happened during my fourth night alone at the plant. Heavy rain moved through the county just after midnight, raising reservoir pressure enough to trigger temporary flood warnings across the western spillways. Around 1:17 a.m., one of the lower security cameras flickered briefly before displaying movement near Gate 4. At first, I assumed another maintenance worker had entered the restricted spillway without authorization. The figure stood motionless beside the flood channel, wearing dark rain gear beneath the sodium floodlights outside. But something about the footage felt wrong immediately. The camera showed heavy rain falling across the concrete spillway while water rushed violently beneath the gate. Yet the figure's reflection in the channel below didn't move with the current at all. It remained perfectly still beneath the water despite the flood runoff surrounding it. Then the emergency radio crackled softly beside the pressure monitors. "Gate pressure stable," a man whispered through heavy static. "Do not acknowledge personnel outside." Before I could answer, the transmission cut off completely. I shut the camera feed off afterward, mostly to calm myself down. Distorted reflections happen constantly in moving water during heavy rainfall. Security footage glitches under storm interference. Still explainable. Still manageable. But smaller things started accumulating after that night. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps moving slowly through the drainage tunnels beneath the lower control room despite the underground access doors remaining locked. Twice, I found wet footprints circling the western spillway catwalks after storms, even though the perimeter gates showed no recorded entry. One morning, the flood siren was activated briefly at exactly 2:11 a.m. before shutting off on its own without any pressure irregularities in the system logs. The worst part wasn't the events themselves. It was how ordinary they felt while happening. Blackwater never produced sudden terror. The plant created the constant sense that something just outside your understanding had been moving quietly through the facility much longer than you'd been there. On my sixth night, I accidentally broke the first rule without realizing it. A storm front rolled across the reservoir around midnight, causing pressure fluctuations inside the western spillway systems. By 12:43 a.m., one of the Gate 4 valve indicators displayed partial obstruction warnings requiring manual inspection from the lower maintenance walkway outside. Normally, the process took maybe 10 minutes at most. I grabbed my flashlight and rain jacket without even thinking about the time. The moment I stepped onto the spillway catwalk, freezing rain hit hard enough to blur visibility beyond the floodlights surrounding the channel. Water thundered beneath the concrete gates while fog rolled slowly across the reservoir surface beyond the fencing. Halfway toward Gate 4, the emergency radio clipped to my jacket crackled suddenly through static. "Daniel," Frank Delaney whispered, "you shouldn't be near the water during rainfall." Every muscle in my body locked instantly because the voice sounded perfect. Exhausted. Human. Then the floodlights near Gate 4 flickered once, and for a brief second, I saw multiple figures standing motionless inside the spillway water beneath the gate, watching me from below the surface. The floodlights stabilized almost immediately afterward, and the figures beneath the water vanished with them. 1 second, they stood motionless inside the spillway current staring upward through the rain. Next, the channel beneath Gate 4 looked empty again except for black water rushing violently through the concrete gates. I remember standing frozen on the catwalk while cold rain soaked through my jacket and pooled inside my gloves. Rationally, I understood how distorted light reflections could create strange shapes in moving water during storms. The human brain looks for patterns instinctively, especially in isolated environments after midnight. That explanation should have been enough. But the radio transmission bothered me more than the figures themselves because Frank Delaney's voice hadn't sounded distorted or broken beneath the static. It sounded tired, familiar somehow. Like someone speaking quietly from another room inside the plant instead of through emergency frequencies. I should have returned to the control room immediately after that. Instead, embarrassment pushed me farther toward the gate. I'd spent years maintaining municipal systems and underground infrastructure. The idea that I was becoming unsettled by old flood channels and local ghost stories during a rainstorm felt ridiculous, even while my instincts kept telling me to leave. The inspection platform beside Gate 4 sat lower than the main spillway walkway directly above the reservoir runoff. Water thundered through the partially open floodgate beneath rusted metal grates slick with rain and algae buildup. My flashlight beam moved across pressure valves, emergency release wheels, and concrete stained dark from decades of flooding. At first, everything looked completely normal. Then I noticed the maintenance lock on Gate 4 hanging open beside the control wheel. Not broken. Unlocked. Someone had accessed the gate manually earlier that night despite no scheduled maintenance being listed anywhere in the system logs. That's when I heard movement below the catwalk. Not water. Footsteps. Slow with deliberate impacts echoing through the drainage tunnel running directly beneath the spillway platform. I crouched instinctively beside the railing, trying to angle my flashlight toward the darkness below. Rain hammered the flood channels hard enough to blur visibility through the lower grates, but I still caught glimpses of movement beneath the runoff water. Shapes drift slowly through the drainage tunnel underneath the gate. Human-sized. Pale against the darkness. Then the emergency radio crackled softly again. "Daniel," Frank whispered through static. "Do not let them see you recognizing them." My stomach tightened immediately because the wording made no sense at all. Before I could process what he meant, another sound echoed upward from beneath the spillway. Someone was climbing the metal ladder connecting the lower drainage tunnels to the inspection platform where I stood. I backed away from the ladder instinctively while rainwater streamed across the concrete around my boots. The climbing sounds stopped halfway up the shaft beneath the platform. Silence settled over the spillway except for the roar of floodwater moving through Gate 4 beneath us. Then a hand appeared slowly through the darkness below the catwalk railing. Pale fingers gripping the metal ladder, slick with rain. Another hand followed moments later. And finally, someone pulled themselves partially into the floodlight beneath the platform. Heavy maintenance raincoat. Blackwater facility patch stitched across the shoulder. Water streaming constantly from the hood, hiding most of the face underneath. But even through the rain and darkness, I recognized the uniform immediately from the old staff photographs hanging upstairs in the administration hall. Frank Delaney. Or something is wearing him. The figure stopped climbing once its head reached the edge of the platform. It didn't try to approach me. Didn't speak. It just remained motionless beneath the spillway lights while black water rushed violently around the drainage tunnels below. Then the flood siren activated somewhere deep inside the plant. One deafening mechanical scream echoes through the reservoir channels hard enough to vibrate the catwalk beneath my feet. The figure beneath the platform slowly tilted its head upward toward me as the emergency lights surrounding Gate 4 shifted from white to deep flashing red. And for one horrifying second, illuminated clearly through the rain, I saw that Frank's reflection in the spillway water below was smiling even though the figure itself wasn't moving at all. I made it back to the lower control room, soaked, shaking, and trying desperately to force what happened at Gate 4 into something explainable. Adrenaline distorts perception. Flood sirens trigger panic responses. Rain and sodium lighting create visual illusions in moving water. I repeated those thoughts to myself over and over while stripping off my wet jacket beside the pressure consoles downstairs. But deep down, I already knew the worst part wasn't what I saw on the spillway platform. It was the reflection beneath the water, smiling independently of the figure above it. That detail stayed lodged inside my head afterward like something my brain physically refused to process correctly. The flood siren shut off moments after I returned underground, and according to the system logs, no emergency pressure release had occurred anywhere in the facility that night. Gate 4 showed normal reservoir levels. No unauthorized access. No active alarms. On paper, nothing unusual had happened at all. The plant changed after that night. Before, Blackwater felt isolated but manageable, an aging water treatment facility buried in the woods beside a reservoir. After Gate 4, the entire place seemed subtly aware of me in ways difficult to explain clearly. The emergency radio became more active almost immediately. Some nights, it transmitted maintenance updates using voices belonging to workers no longer employed there. Other night, the static formed whispers too quiet to understand fully unless I leaned closer toward the speaker. Once, around 2:11 a.m., I heard my ex-wife's voice softly asking whether I finally understood what it felt like to drown slowly while nobody listened properly anymore. I disconnected the radio after that, but the speakers throughout the lower control room continued crackling softly with static even while powered down. And always, beneath the noise of the pumps and flood channels surrounding the station, I could hear movement inside the drainage tunnels below the plant. Footsteps. Multiple now. Wandering slowly through the spillways after midnight. Then the cameras started changing. At first, it was small things. Motion blur near Gate 4 during storms. Distorted reflections are moving incorrectly in the spillway water. Figures appear near the reservoir fencing for single frames before disappearing from the footage again. But by the end of the week, the lower security system barely resembled normal surveillance anymore. Some nights, the cameras pointed toward empty flood channels while reflections beneath the water showed dozens of pale figures standing motionless below the surface. Other times, the footage captured maintenance workers walking through the spillway tunnels despite no personnel being scheduled on-site overnight except me. I started reviewing archived recordings from previous storms, hoping to prove the system corruption had existed before I arrived at Blackwater. Instead, I discovered something much worse. The same figures appeared in footage dating back nearly 15 years. Different storms. Different camera systems. Same silhouettes beneath the water near Gate 4 are watching the catwalks above. And in almost every recording, one figure wearing Frank Delaney's raincoat stood closest to the surface. The worst incident happened during another severe rainstorm nearly a week after the spillway encounter. Reservoir pressure climbed high enough to trigger automatic gate monitoring across the western flood channels around 1:50 a.m. I stayed inside the control room this time, refusing to inspect anything physically near Gate 4 after dark, regardless of the alarms. Then the pressure indicators changed suddenly. Gate 1 stable. Gate 2 stable. Gate 3 stable. Gate 4 opening. My stomach dropped instantly because I hadn't touched the flood controls. None of the automated systems should have activated during manual lock status. Yet on the security monitor, I watched the massive spillway gate slowly rising by itself while black reservoir water surged violently through the channel beneath it. Then the emergency radio activated beside the console. "Daniel," Frank whispered through static. "They only come close enough to the surface during rainfall." At that exact moment, one of the lower drainage cameras shifted downward toward the flood channel beneath Gate 4. And for the first time since arriving at Blackwater, I saw how many figures were actually moving beneath the water. Hundreds. Standing shoulder to shoulder below the spillway current like a crowd waiting silently underneath the reservoir. Then every face slowly turned upward toward the camera at the same time. After the camera showed hundreds of faces beneath Gate 4, I stopped trying to explain Blackwater through stress or exhaustion. Hallucinations don't appear consistently across archived footage spanning 15 years. Equipment malfunctions don't produce synchronized movement patterns underwater during storms. Something beneath the reservoir existed independently from me long before I arrived at the plant. The next morning, I started searching through Blackwater's maintenance archives more aggressively than before. Most of the older records sat untouched inside a damp storage room beneath the administration wing, where flood reports and engineering logs dated back to the original construction of the facility during the late 1970s. I spent hours digging through mold-stained binders and county engineering documents until I found references to the land underneath the western reservoir itself. Before Blackwater existed, the valley had contained a small mining settlement called Mercer's Hollow that flooded after a retaining dam collapsed during heavy rainfall in 1968. Official reports listed 34 casualties. Bodies recovered, 19. The deeper I went into the archives, the stranger the records became. Early construction crews reported hearing voices through the drainage tunnels during excavation work near the western spillways. Several workers refused assignments around the future Gate 4 channel after repeated claims of seeing people standing underwater beneath the unfinished floodgates. One engineer described reflections moving independently from the workers above the spillway during rainstorms. Then I found the old county investigation into Frank Delaney's disappearance. Officially, Frank drowned during a nighttime pressure release after slipping from the maintenance catwalk. But buried inside the witness reports, several employees described hearing Frank speaking over the emergency radio nearly 20 minutes after surveillance footage showed him falling into the flood channel. One maintenance worker claimed Frank repeatedly warned them not to look into the water when the gate opens. Another described seeing multiple people climbing out of the spillway beneath the rainstorm despite no bodies ever being recovered from the reservoir afterward. Then I discovered Frank's notebook. Not an official maintenance log. A personal journal hidden behind loose concrete panels inside the lower control room beneath Gate 4. Most of the entries focused on ordinary overnight maintenance work at first: pump repairs, pressure fluctuations, staffing shortages. But over time, the writing changed completely. Frank became obsessed with the idea that the reservoir remembered people who died inside it. Entire pages documented voices speaking through drainage pipes during storms and reflections behaving independently near the spillways after midnight. One repeated phrase appeared throughout the notebook over and over: "The water imitates grief because grief makes people look longer." According to Frank, the figures beneath Gate 4 didn't pull people into the reservoir physically. They waited for recognition first. The more emotionally attached someone became to the voices or faces beneath the water, the clearer the imitations grew afterward. Eventually, the reflections stopped copying entirely and started moving separately from the originals above the surface. That night, the emergency radio activated before midnight for the first time since I arrived at Blackwater. "Daniel," my ex-wife whispered through static. "Perfectly." Same exhausted tone from the final argument before she left our apartment for good. "You never listened when people were drowning beside you." My chest tightened immediately because those were almost the exact words she used the night our marriage ended after months of me emotionally shutting down during her depression. I disconnected the radio battery without answering, but the voice continued anyway through the dead speakers mounted around the control room. "Frank understood eventually," she whispered. "That's why the water keeps him near the surface." Then the lower spillway monitors flickered simultaneously. Every camera inside the western flood channels displayed the same image: Gate 4 standing completely open beneath heavy rain while pale figures climbed slowly upward through the spillway water underneath it. The flood siren activated seconds later. Not one blast this time. Continuous. Mechanical screaming echoes through the underground control room, hard enough to shake dust loose from the concrete ceiling overhead. Then the pressure monitors started changing by themselves. Gate 1 is opening. Gate 2 is opening. Gate 3 is opening. Every western spillway is releasing reservoir water simultaneously, despite manual lockdown procedures remaining active across the system. The lower drainage cameras shifted downward toward the flood channels beneath the plant. And for the first time, I saw some of the figures beneath the reservoir reaching the surface fully. Human-shaped silhouettes were climbing slowly through the rushing spillway water while their reflections beneath them moved seconds ahead of the bodies above. Then one of the figures stepped directly beneath the floodlight near Gate 4 and raised its head toward the camera. It had my face. Seeing my own face beneath Gate 4 changed something fundamental inside me. Up until then, the reservoir still felt external somehow, a dangerous thing hidden beneath the plant but separate from me personally. After the spillway cameras showed my reflection climbing through the floodwater alongside the others, Blackwater stopped feeling like a workplace entirely. The plant became something closer to a conversation already happening around me long before I arrived. Frank's journal suddenly made horrifying sense in ways it hadn't before. The water didn't imitate people randomly. It learned them through emotional recognition until eventually the reflections became stable enough to separate from the originals above the surface. That's why the voices always targeted grief specifically. Regret makes human beings stare longer than fear does. And every moment of recognition gave whatever lived beneath the reservoir more structure to work with afterward. I stopped sleeping properly after that night. Most mornings, I sat alone in the maintenance apartment above the administration wing, gazing at rain drifting across the reservoir through the windows while trying to convince myself to quit the job immediately. But leaving Blackwater no longer felt simple. Frank's journal repeatedly warned that once the water recognized someone fully, distance stopped mattering. Several entries described former employees hearing reservoir sounds through household plumbing leaks after leaving the plant permanently. One maintenance worker reportedly drowned in his bathtub months after resigning despite no signs of forced entry or intoxication. Whether those stories were true no longer mattered. I believed them anyway. So instead of running, I started studying the patterns the same way Frank apparently had during his final months at Blackwater. The voices grew clearer after emotional reactions. Heavy rainfall increased activity near Gate 4 dramatically. And most importantly, the reflections beneath the water became more independent after midnight if the spillway gates remained open long enough. I created my own rules after that. Never look directly into standing water during storms. Never respond verbally to voices coming through the drainage tunnels. Never allow Gate 4 to remain open for longer than 4 minutes after midnight, regardless of reservoir pressure warnings. Most importantly, never acknowledge reflections behaving incorrectly, even if they use familiar faces. For a while, the system actually seemed calmer afterward. The emergency radio stayed mostly silent. The cameras showed fewer distortions near the spillways. Some nights, the reservoir almost felt ordinary again beneath the floodlights outside. But Blackwater adapted quickly once I stopped reacting emotionally the way it wanted. The voices became more personal, more specific. Instead of generic imitations, the radio transmissions started replaying exact memories from different periods of my life. Arguments, phone calls, conversations I'd forgotten completely until hearing them whispered back through static beneath the plant after midnight. Then the reflections started appearing away from the water. The first time happened inside the lower control room around 2 a.m. during another rainstorm. I glanced briefly toward the dark computer monitor beside the pressure consoles and saw my reflection staring back seconds before I actually turned my head. Not distorted. Delayed. The movement happened independently for less than a second, but that was enough. Afterward, it started happening everywhere throughout the facility. in puddles along the spillway walkways, in polished valve housings inside the maintenance tunnels. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of my reflection watching me from surfaces I wasn't even standing near yet. The worst incidents happened during heavy storms when the underground drainage systems flooded beneath the plant. That's when the voices inside the pipes sounded closest to the surface. Not screaming. Conversational. Like dozens of people talking softly beneath the concrete floor just outside the limits of understanding. 3 nights later, I found the final pages of Frank's journal hidden inside the emergency valve housing near Gate 4 itself. The writing looked rushed and unstable compared to the earlier entries, smeared by water damage across the paper. "The reservoir isn't haunted," one sentence read. "It's incomplete." Another line repeated several times beneath it, hard enough to tear through the pages. "The reflections want replacement, not death." According to Frank's final notes, the spillway gates didn't simply control water pressure throughout Blackwater. They controlled separation. The reservoir remained calm as long as enough distance existed between the figures beneath the water and the people above it. But after prolonged recognition exposure, the gates started opening automatically because the reflections eventually stopped understanding which side of the surface they belonged to. I barely finished reading the last page before the flood siren activated again somewhere beneath the plant. Continuous mechanical screaming echoed through the spillway tunnels while every pressure monitor inside the lower control room surged violently into red warning status. And on the security cameras overlooking the western channels, Gate 4 had begun opening by itself again. The flood sirens screamed through Blackwater continuously while the western spillway systems failed one after another across the control monitors. Gate 1 is opening. Gate 2 is opening. Gate 3 is opening. Every reservoir channel is releasing water simultaneously into the underground flood tunnels beneath the plant. But Gate 4 moved differently from the others. The massive steel barrier rose slowly in controlled increments instead of responding to emergency pressure automatically, almost like someone carefully operating it manually from somewhere below the spillway. Rain hammered the reservoir hard enough to blur visibility across the security cameras while black water surged violently through the open channels beneath the floodlights outside. Then the emergency radio activated beside the pressure consoles. "Daniel," Frank whispered through static. "It's trying to equalize the reflections now." My stomach tightened instantly because his tone no longer sounded frightened. Just exhausted. Like someone explaining a process already too far along to stop completely. The lower drainage cameras flickered moments later. Then stabilized. Every screen displayed the same thing. People standing motionless inside the spillway. Water beneath Gate 4. Not reflections anymore. Bodies. Dozens of them crowded shoulder to shoulder beneath the rushing current while rain hammered the flood channels overhead. Some wore old mining uniforms from the Mercer's Hollow disaster photographs I'd found in the archives. Others wore maintenance jackets belonging to former Blackwater employees. Frank Delaney stood nearest the spillway surface in his raincoat, staring directly into the camera with water streaming constantly from his hood. And standing beside him beneath the floodlights was another version of me. Same work jacket. Same exhausted posture. Same expression I'd seen in bathroom mirrors for weeks now. My reflection slowly raised one hand toward the camera seconds before every monitor inside the control room distorted into static simultaneously. Then something knocked from underneath the concrete floor. Not water pressure. Not pipes. Knocking. Slow with deliberate impacts, echoes upward from the drainage tunnels directly beneath the lower control room. Another followed seconds later. Then another. The sounds moved gradually through the underground spillway system like something climbing upward beneath the plant itself. I backed away instinctively while the flood siren continued screaming through the facility around me. Then the maintenance lights flickered once, plunging the control room into darkness for half a second. During that moment, I heard voices whispering from inside the drainage grates surrounding the room. Hundreds of them layered together beneath the roar of moving water. Some crying. Some laughed quietly. Others repeat fragments of conversations from different periods of my life. My ex-wife is asking why I never listened properly anymore. Walter warned me never to acknowledge reflections after midnight. Frank Delaney whispers the same sentence repeatedly through the pipes beneath the floor. Do not let them reach still water. The emergency spillway doors exploded open moments later. Floodwater surged into the lower control corridors hard enough to throw equipment sideways across the room instantly. Black reservoir water rushed through the underground plant carrying debris, mud, and something far worse beneath the surface movement. Pale hands gripped the flooded corridor railings as figures began pulling themselves slowly upward through the spillway current into the facility itself. Human-shaped silhouettes soaked black from reservoir water, climbing silently into the emergency lighting one after another. Some wore Blackwater maintenance gear from different decades. Others looked incomplete somehow, faces shifting subtly beneath reflections moving independently across their skin like water trying to remember human structure properly. But the worst figure emerged last. My reflection climbed through the floodwater directly toward the control room entrance while the voices inside the pipes fell completely silent around us. Then it smiled. Not maliciously. Relieved. Like something finally reaching the correct side of the surface after waiting underwater for years. The thing wearing my face stopped just outside the flooded control room while black reservoir water streamed constantly from its clothes onto the concrete floor. Behind it, dozens of pale figures stood motionless inside the rising spillway water filling the underground tunnels around the plant. None of them moved aggressively. None needed to. Because reflected in every flooded surface surrounding the room, the spillway water, the control panels, the emergency glass, I could already see my own reflection lagging slightly behind my movements now. Just enough delay to understand something horrifying. Blackwater no longer recognized which version of me belonged above the water anymore. For several seconds, I stood frozen inside the flooding control room, watching my reflection breathe half a second later than I did. Water surged through the underground corridors around my knees while emergency lights painted the spillway tunnels in pulsing red shadows. The figures surrounding the room remained perfectly still beneath the rising floodwater, their pale faces reflecting unnaturally across every surface inside Blackwater. But the thing wearing my face kept watching me with that same calm, relieved expression, like something exhausted after a very long journey finally arriving home. Then it spoke in my voice. "The reservoir doesn't want bodies," it whispered over the sound of rushing water. "It wants balance." Behind it, Frank Delaney slowly raised one hand toward the spillway tunnels deeper beneath the plant. More figures were climbing upward through the floodwater below, endless silhouettes surfacing silently through the drainage channels under Gate 4. That was the moment I finally understood what Blackwater actually did. The treatment plant wasn't filtering water. It was containing memory. Mercer's Hollow, flooded decades earlier, are with dozens of people trapped underground inside the mining tunnels beneath the valley. The reservoir built afterward buried the disaster beneath millions of gallons of water and concrete spillways, but the dead never disappeared completely. Over time, the water learned how to imitate the emotional residue left behind by grief, guilt, and unresolved recognition. That's why the reflections moved independently first. Reflections already exist between versions of reality naturally. Blackwater simply created enough pressure, emotional and physical, for the copies beneath the surface to eventually separate. Frank understood that too late. So had every technician before him. The floodgates weren't protecting the reservoir from overflowing. They were preventing the reflections from crossing fully into the world above the waterline. The thing wearing my face stepped closer through the flooded corridor while the emergency siren screamed endlessly throughout the plant. "You already know how this works," it said calmly. "People become easier to copy once they stop recognizing themselves properly." The sentence hit harder than it should have because part of me knew it was true long before Blackwater. After the divorce. After months of emotional numbness and drifting through meaningless jobs, trying not to think too deeply about my life anymore. I'd already spent years feeling detached from my own reflection before the reservoir ever started imitating it. Maybe that's why the water attached to me so quickly. Maybe grief isn't what the reservoir feeds on exactly. Maybe it feeds on disconnection. And standing there knee-deep in floodwater, watching another version of myself breathe independently across the corridor, I realized something horrifying. The reflection wasn't trying to replace me violently. I genuinely believed it already was me. Then I noticed the emergency spillway controls mounted beside the lower flood channels. Manual reservoir purge system. If activated, the western spillways would open completely, draining most of Blackwater's flood channels directly into the abandoned quarry basin beyond the valley. The process would destroy the underground tunnels permanently under pressure collapse. It would also flood half the treatment facility and probably kill anyone trapped inside the lower levels. The reflection followed my gaze toward the controls immediately. For the first time since surfacing from the spillway water, its expression changed. Not fear exactly. Urgency. "If you empty the reservoir," it whispers, "the reflections won't disappear. They'll spread." Behind it, the figures standing throughout the flooded tunnels slowly began turning their heads toward me in perfect synchronization. Hundreds of wet reflections watched silently beneath the emergency lights while the water continued rising around our legs. And somewhere deep beneath the plant, hidden below the roar of the spillways, I could hear more voices climbing upward through the drainage tunnels underneath Gate 4. I pulled the purge lever anyway. The effect on Blackwater was immediate. Every floodgate throughout the western reservoir channels groaned violently as emergency pressure systems activated across the facility. Sirens shifted from continuous warning screams into full evacuation alarms, while massive amounts of reservoir water surged away from the underground spillways toward the quarry basin outside. The entire plant shook beneath the sudden release pressure hard enough to crack concrete along the lower control room walls. Then the figures reacted for the first time. Not attacking. Reaching. Hundreds of pale hands stretched upward through the draining floodwater while reflections shattered violently across every surface surrounding the room. My reflection lunged toward me across the corridor just as the spillway current reversed direction beneath Gate 4. And in the final seconds before the underground tunnels collapsed under pressure failure, I saw something inside its expression that disturbed me more than rage ever could. Desperation. Like something terrified of being left underwater alone again. I barely escaped the lower spillway tunnels before Blackwater began collapsing inward beneath the pressure release. The emergency purge drained millions of gallons of reservoir water through the western flood channels in less than 15 minutes, overwhelming the abandoned quarry basin beyond the valley and rupturing half the underground infrastructure beneath the treatment plant. I remember climbing the maintenance stairs toward the surface while floodwater thundered violently through the collapsing tunnels below me. Concrete cracked behind the spillway walls hard enough to shake the entire facility while emergency lights flickered through clouds of steam and dust rising from broken pipes underground. Then came the sound from beneath Gate 4 itself. Not machinery. Not water pressure. A deep-layered groan echoes upward through the drainage system like something enormous shifting far below the reservoir floor after decades trapped underwater. The noise followed me all the way out of the lower control room and into the storm above ground before disappearing beneath the roar of collapsing spillways behind the plant. By sunrise, most of the western flood channels had caved in completely. Officially, the county classified the disaster as a catastrophic infrastructure failure caused by reservoir overpressure during severe weather conditions. That explanation satisfied most people because Blackwater was already decades overdue for modernization and safety inspections. Nobody questioned why recovery crews permanently sealed the underground spillway systems beneath reinforced concrete afterward. Nobody asked why the remaining reservoir water around Gate 4 stayed unnaturally dark for months despite full chemical treatment procedures. The investigators focused mostly on whether exhaustion contributed to my decision-making during the emergency. I let them believe that version because certain truths stop sounding more believable the more accurately you describe them. Still, one detail unsettled even the county engineers overseeing the cleanup. During drainage operations, sonar equipment repeatedly detected human-sized movement patterns beneath the remaining reservoir floor despite the spillway channels being completely emptied. I left Pennsylvania 2 weeks later and never worked on municipal infrastructure again. For a while, I convinced myself that the purge destroyed whatever existed beneath Blackwater permanently. Trauma eventually becomes easier to package into manageable explanations once enough distance exists between you and the place where it happened. But some things refuse to fit into rational categories afterward. About 3 months after the collapse, I received a package with no return address containing only a damaged security drive recovered from the underground control room. Against every instinct telling me not to watch it, I connected the drive to my laptop late one night and opened the final surviving camera recording from Gate 4. The footage showed the flooded spillway tunnels moments before I activated the emergency purge. Pale figures stood motionless throughout the rising water while emergency lights flashed across the concrete corridors underground. And standing closest to the camera beneath the spillway gate was my reflection. Same face. Same soaked maintenance jacket. Same exhausted expression. As the footage ended, the reflection slowly looked upward toward the security camera and mouthed something silently through the water. "You left me behind. I barely sleep now. Most nights, I wake around 2:11 a.m., convinced I hear water moving through the walls of my apartment, even though the building plumbing barely works properly. Sometimes reflections in dark windows react just slightly too late after I move away from them. Other nights, during heavy rainstorms, I catch glimpses of pale figures standing beneath flooded streets or reflected in puddles along empty sidewalks late at night. But the worst moments happen near still water. Bathroom mirrors. Black coffee. Dark television screens after they power off. Every once in a while, for less than a second, I catch my reflection watching me with an expression that doesn't belong to me anymore. Patient. Like something still waiting quietly beneath the surface for the right conditions to rise again. And during storms, if rain falls hard enough against the windows after midnight, I sometimes hear Frank Delaney whispering through the pipes somewhere inside the walls around me. "Gate 4 is still open," he says quietly. "And the water remembers you now."